I'll just be here for a very brief moment to welcome you all to the chapel of Pusey House, the chapel of the resurrection. Dr. Jonathan Price, the Barry Fellow, is going to introduce our speaker. It's great to have you here. I hope you enjoy the talk, and only you'll explain the list as well. Welcome.
Hello, friends. Welcome. We are kicking off a colloquium. We do these collegiate colloquium, or colloquia, as we've done a number of them, at least once a term. We do them in cooperation with one of the historic colleges of Oxford, and tomorrow we're actually going to have the colloquium in cooperation with two, with All Souls, Fellows of All Souls, and Oriel, especially because those are two models of the college that persist up to the present, with some of their historical character still intact, and some of the ethos and the strong sense of the things a college can and maybe should do that are still practiced and are still part of the charitable purpose of these colleges, including things like public liturgy, for instance, and free inquiry, polygenerational transmission of knowledge in communities that are by necessity closed. But I'm not going to speak to you much more about this, nor am I going to speak to you much tomorrow. I run these so that people can tell me things I don't know. And I hope that's why you're coming today to you know, that emptiness we all have that's filled by the charity of others instructing us and teaching us, and that is part of the reason for the existence of the college as a special institution of prayer and learning and charity. Dr. Andrew Hegarty, our speaker tonight, is an independent scholar. He is very fond of the college and has led a very busy life as an historian and doing other good works. It should maybe be a judgment on colleges that he isn't currently in the fellowship of one of Oxford's, or even the other places, colleges. But I've spoken to him about this, and he holds nothing against colleges for not yet having brought him into their fellowship. He focuses on early modern colleges, not only here but elsewhere. And when you heard elsewhere, you're probably thinking of the other place, which is not predominantly what he focuses on. It's Salamanca and Paris, not Bologna, a papal foundation, but some of the colleges that were associated with local monarchs and their desires to put themselves forward in the world in the contest of knowledge and truth. He's an old Mertonian, so he is one of us, as it were, in that sense. He knows it, he knows what it smells like, he knows what it tastes like, he knows what it's meant to be. He's edited a nearly 800-page volume on the history, though, of St. John's College, which was from 1555 to 1660, and tried to get an account of everyone from the kitchen boy to the heads of house and what they did and said, a very long stretch of history. And so 800 pages was almost nearly enough to account for what happened during that period. And it's available for the price that you'd expect an 800-page book on the history of St. John's College would be available for, but I know from experience, if you send him an email, he might send you a PDF of a chapter or two, highlighting. Also, he was the assistant editor of Magdalen College's history, and so has had experience with some of the medieval colleges that made their way into the modern world, re-articulated themselves in a Europe that was still busy with understanding itself as a Latin heritage intellectual environment, but was also adapting to new knowledge, new ways of thinking, rediscovery of old ways of thinking, and a synthesis into what would become the modern age. It was not yet known to be modern, although it was the mode. Now, that being said, I'm going to hand you over to his capable hands in one moment, but I'm going to pass this around, which is, we would like to send you messages that are shorter than my introduction, that invite you to other lectures and colloquia, and we are a place that's rich in many things, but we are not actually a rich place. If you would like to make a card donation, this can be done quietly as the basket comes around, or ready money can be put in this basket. If you need to make change for something, feel free, we won't look, but we'll happily receive a small donation to help keep the lights on and to keep this place warm. We don't have the technology to keep it cool. With that being said, I'd like to turn you over to Dr. Andrew Hegarty for traditional collegiality, both here and elsewhere.
I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and I suspect some of those present know very well what a college is, but others may not.
And so I'm going to take a line which, if you like, is a bit of a survey which will prepare the ground a little bit, I think, for those attending the colloquium tomorrow, which will have more specialised bits. Now, when I was an undergraduate half a century ago, it used to be said, only half in jest, that if an American were to ask what the difference was between the apparently similar universities of Oxford and Cambridge, it might help to tell him or her that in Oxford, the South had won the Civil War. And I think 50 years ago, there was an element of truth in that. The colleges had a certain autonomy vis-à-vis the university. They had a certain, was actually different from Cambridge. And I'm not going to speak about this. Not going to claim that colleges are operating with states' rights or anything like that. But I do want to look at the notion of collegiality, looking at Oxford and elsewhere as a key to grasping the best that can be made of a certain kind of educational, cultural, social and formative experience, at least when circumstances permit and the user is alert to taking a firm grip on his or her chances. I am not, of course, in any way suggesting that all members of colleges have always been disinterested or free of that perennial and single-minded career orientation which can vitiate education. I must say also that I am not going to speak of collegiality in a sense beloved today of ideologically motivated academic administrators, managerially minded folk who have, in pursuit of control and homogenization, foisted upon others a pernicious vocabulary. For diversity, equity and inclusion bureaucracies all over the world, collegiality is too often a weaponized organizational tool, such as business school theorists, I had almost said terrorists, love to tout. It often amounts to policing consensus in a heavy-handed way. Widespread use of the word often buries traditional understandings. Colleagues are often requested, in effect required, as the old British passport used to say, to be collegial at all times, by which I think they mean committed, at least in their public words and actions, to a form of groupthink. It's my intention rather to present here for consideration traditional elements of academic collegiality that have little to do with such abuses, but that are of a certainty, I think, being elbowed aside in contemporary Gadarene rush into the abyss of madness. The term collegium in Latin, without going into minutiae, which I believe others will touch on more adequately in tomorrow's colloquium, carries with it historical baggage dating back even to the Roman Republic. At one time, groupings known as collegia were thought to be subversive, dangerous to the state. They were placed under strict licensing by Roman law, other than for specified religious and burial purposes, for the greater good of all. There have been other periods too in which the private worlds of multiform colleges have seemed dangerous to the powers that be and have had restrictions placed on them. This suggests that they do at least matter. The academic collegia that emerged in the medieval era alongside other colleges of the hospital and or collegiate church varieties were influenced in some measure by trade guild organizations typical of the period, as well as by older juridical religious notions. In certain ways, I sense that the new canon law of the high medieval church was actually more sympathetic to and supportive of collegia than had been a secular civil law that harked back to Rome. And that, I think, had its impact on the early academic collegia that are coeval with the canon law. In England, a pervasive notion of quasi-secular legal trusts, themselves often suspect to the authorities, seems to me to have become really significant for these bodies only much later on, and in a somewhat fuzzy manner. Again, I understand that others better qualified than I in matters juridical, will be covering some of these matters during tomorrow's colloquium. Academic colleges are associated in their typical early manifestations, especially with the universities of Paris and Oxford, which were then focused on a propedeutic arts curriculum, followed by a supremely prestigious theology course that culminated after many years in the mastership or doctorate in sacred theology. When I say many years, I think it's worth realizing that in classical Paris, after the Master of Arts degree, it was probably 14 years minimum before you become a doctor. So we are talking of very long periods of time. Such studies greatly interested monks and friars. The immense growth of mendicant religious orders of friars, above all Dominicans and Franciscans from the early 13th century, led to clashes with secular, that is, non-religious clergy, who felt control of their theology faculties, as well as of some of their greatly valued privileges, to be under threat. In university cities or towns, moreover, monks, friars, and other religious were supported through the long years of higher studies by local residential houses of their own orders, while seculars had no such solid props to see them through to the distant end of what we might now style graduate or postgraduate studies. The College of the Sorbonne in Paris, founded circa 1257, and Merton College in Oxford, 1264-1274, were established by secular ecclesiastics who had pull with their kings. That's Robert of Sorbonne, Walter of Merton. For the education of secular students in higher rather than undergraduate studies. All Souls College, Oxford, might be considered in some ways an atypical survivor of the earlier secular colleges. The founders sought a well-formed upper clergy, upper secular clergy, that is. At Merton, religious was specifically prohibited. This was for secular clergy alone. The clerical state included then many tonsured men who had not yet taken on the priesthood and who in not a few cases never would. Over the next few centuries, more colleges were added within and without these and other universities. Often their charters and bulls outline something like an ideal threefold purpose. First, the worship of God. Second, the advancement of learning. And third, the supporting of the studies of qualified individuals whose growth in virtue was also often explicitly sought. Even after the 16th century, colleges here in Oxford formally retained much of that, while the university at large had in good measure become a rather laicized body by the early 17th century. I can go into that in questions later if you wish. The format varied considerably, even within particular universities, but broadly speaking, secular, that is non-religious, non-monkish academic colleges, came over centuries to exhibit some typical shared characteristics. Our time is limited this afternoon, so forgive my treating a selection of these now by means of something akin to spoken bullet points. Item: a common purse, controlled and administered either by the socii, the fellows, in some cases all of them together, in others only the seniors amongst them, or by some external body of trustees. Both types of systems existed. Item: certain all but constitutive privileges granted for the benefit of study by popes, kings and municipalities in variegated mixes. It cannot be exaggerated just how vital and constructive the men and women of the past thought tooth and nail protection of such privileges to be. Item: often, but not always, control by the fellows over admission to their own number, which could become highly competitive over time, and often subject to corrupt practices. I'm sure you've never come across those in Oxford colleges, but they've always existed. In other places, election was entrusted to bodies quite external to collegiate the entity, and their choice was frequently confined by statute to men originating in certain provinces, towns, or dioceses. Item: a common chapel for the worship of God, and in some cases to keep up a really elaborate liturgy, served by chaplains and choristers who were also often on the foundation, and indeed sometimes properly scholars themselves. This liturgy was often focused on prayer for the repose of the souls of the founder and his or her family. Some academic colleges have indeed not always been entirely distinguishable from collegiate churches focused on hospital work, charitable relief of suffering, and or the offering of pious suffrages for the souls of the dead. Item, a common kitchen and hall for catering and eating. Commensality being all but essential to collegiality from the very outset. A daily ration was provided gratis to members of the foundation, that is, foundationers, as I shall call them, as well as at times to the poor scholars who served the foundationers collectively or individually and thereby paid their way to education. Oxford commensality has today been transferred for very many married and non-resident fellows, in good measure to SCR lunches. I recall a student of Christ Church, who would have been styled a fellow anywhere else, telling me years ago that he could generally pick the brains of one of his colleagues over lunch if he had any intellectual query whatsoever that was troubling him. So, a connection between commensality and also intellectual pursuits. Item, a common library, with in some cases from early on a termly or otherwise fixed system of distribution and borrowing, sometimes executed literally under the gaze of the whole proprietary community on fixed days of the year. The appointment of proper or recognisably modern librarians, as opposed to cleaners or sweepers, generally came very much later on. Sometimes I'm very amused when Oxford librarians and archivists speak as though if they didn't come in on Monday, the books would fall to pieces. They survived perfectly well without librarians for centuries. Item, a warden, principal or president, his title varied considerably, and other officers such as financial bursars who represented the corporation and administered its funds and rules with statutory and delegated powers. Heads of houses in pre-modern Oxford were very much more powerful within their communities than today, when fellows in recent decades have resorted to ruthless Procrustean methods, especially during vacancies, to cut them down to size. Item, at least some academic exercises and or disputations held within the institution for the benefit of members, on occasion also for outsider non-foundationers, even if these were not always connected to taking university-level exercises and degrees. Now, such private collegiate exercises might be propedeutic to students entering, when deemed qualified by their colleges, into the lists of public university exercises that actually led to degrees. This public-private distinction really mattered in universities of the past. When at the end of the 16th century, the Jesuit Robert Parsons, later Balliol College, was advising Philip II of Spain what to do in order to achieve a thoroughly Catholic reformation of the University of Oxford after the anticipated conquest that never happened, he wanted the king to eradicate private collegiate teaching and to have only well-endowed public lectures run by central institutions, as for example in the University of Salamanca in Catholic Spain. It must be supposed that he assumed it would be easier to be assured of true Catholic doctrine being taught publicly in full view of all than in what was communicated privately behind college gates by possibly heterodox teachers. Colleges might, in the worst of cases, be nests of heterodoxy and of deviancy. The denizens of private colleges might be protected by their institutions in studies and opinions that could then be suitably disguised or understated for exercises performed on the public university stage. I think it's very important to understand this if you're going to understand how colleges operated within universities like Oxford and Cambridge. Item, in the course above all of the 16th century, there occurred changes in both words and things that altered the nature and purpose of colleges in many places. There appeared in many towns colleges that taught arts and elements of philosophy, but that lacked formal association with existing universities. The Jesuit colleges of France were perhaps the prime example, undermining the arts faculties of Paris and of other universities. Some colleges, whether or not they changed their formal titles, were granted degree-giving powers, and in effect became universities. In places, colleges and universities became muddled. The term academy appeared now in fairly general use to cover above all universities and colleges that lacked a papally or imperially granted jus ubique docendi, the notional right given one with a locally imposed master's or doctor's degree to teach anywhere. Members of Lutheran bodies in Germany, with such a privilege granted them by the emperor, were prone to violent resentment of new Calvinist or Reformed institutions. One Lutheran scholar whom I read declared these to be no better than prostibula, or brothels. So, pre-ecumenical days. Over the centuries, and to varying extents according to local politico-religious circumstances and the regimes obtaining, other elements began to appear in collegiate bodies, typically, item, an increasing admission, in some cases, of truly lay students alongside secular clerics. Item, the creation from common funds of travelling fellowships to allow one or more fellows at a time to visit universities abroad for more advanced studies and a wider academic professional experience. In the early modern era at Oxbridge, civil, that is Roman lawyers and medical men often sought a truly higher education abroad, often in Padua, where standards were often very much higher. Item, increasingly from the 16th century onwards, admission to many colleges of younger undergraduate students who were still minors at law and subject to control by masters appointed in loco parentis as tutors to their pupils. This sometimes occurred at Oxbridge via a gradual collegiate absorption of unendowed halls or hostels that had hitherto catered in some measure for young arts students and jurists. Early tutors had often only the slightest of teaching functions. The terms tutors and pupils seem to have come from Roman civil law, and the academic elements involved were initially subsidiary. Some pupils would have been poor scholars paying their way via menial services to college foundations and or to senior men in the college. Item, following the last development that grew up in Oxbridge as well as in a rather different and more restricted way at Paris. In the course of the 16th century, a collegiate apparatus of teaching with salaried lecturers and deans in the various academic subject areas. These supplemented or gradually replaced university teaching and its academic discipline. Tutors might arrange, in consultation with parents or guardians, a sort of smorgasbord of classes and reading for young men of position who had no interest whatever in taking academic degrees and sought only a certain polish before passing on, in the case of England and Wales at least, to ingest also a smattering of law suited to a future justice of the peace from one of the Inns of Court in London. As the Jesuit parsons well knew, parents might choose colleges for their sons based on religious ideological considerations and or a willingness on the part of the authorities therein to turn a blind eye. A college was likely to develop over time its own ethos, which might be very interesting to parents. Item, the admission of fee-paying men, non-foundationers, commoners, to share the common life and table of those whose scholarships, fellowships from the common foundation provided them with free board and accommodation, and often small stipends, plus annual dividends out of corporate surpluses. Such additional income from these young men, these commoners, was welcomed, as was the potential patronage that came with having the wealthy and powerful living cheek by jowl with foundationers over years, and indeed moulded by the same distinctive internal corporate ethos. Item, by the early 20th century, at least in Oxbridge, there had developed a rather complete and at least potentially effective tutorial system of education, which, let it be noted, has ever been evolving and changing. Constant reinvention, whether initiated from within or without, has been typical of universities and colleges everywhere and at all times. Item, the development, especially in the late 19th and 20th centuries, of complex and expensive common collegiate spaces and facilities for sports, theatre, music, clubs and meetings of all kinds. All that, indeed, with no little danger, in the midst of such great plenty, of losing sight of an aboriginal austerity that had long sat well with a sort of virtuous common purpose. Item, with increasing complexity, there have grown up in most Oxford colleges ever since the 17th century 3 levels of common or combination rooms, these being social organisations as well as normally physical spaces. A senior common room for full fellows, usually now academics engaged in some mixture of research, lecturing and tutorial work. A middle or graduate common room for postgraduate students, some of these undertaken for remuneration as well as experience teaching of younger undergraduates. And a junior common room for undergraduates, each of these enjoying its own elected officers and structures. Now here I'm going to abandon my bullet point manner of proceeding and move on in other ways. Until at least the 19th century, there survived at Oxbridge, alongside endowed colleges, an older type of institution, already mentioned in passing, namely the academic hall or hostel. The name survives now in Oxford's ancient St Edmund Hall, which became a college only in the mid-20th century, but was permitted to retain its venerable title. It's much older than most of the colleges. And such was normally a largely unendowed institution in which a principal, licensed by the university, and usually of at least Master of Arts status, offered undergraduates and some senior men accommodation and facilities lesser than, but analogous to, those of colleges. These older halls have disappeared, but in Oxford at least, permanent academic or private halls appeared from the late 19th century, usually linked to Protestant groups engaged in theological education or to Catholic religious orders. These have functioned rather like colleges, but have often been controlled by an external body, and not only by an internal corporation of fellows. Some have in the course of time become colleges. One thinks of Mansfield, for example. The central university bureaucracy now seems to have a real animus against such bodies. There are also a few theological colleges with close, looser links to the university. At present, there is virtually no trace left in Oxford of a complementary form of social organisation, the nation, such as still survives usefully at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and which had been significant in the Paris and Salamanca of their respective golden ages. In the newer English and Welsh universities founded from the 19th century onwards, there are often found halls of residence. Some are run directly by universities, others by charitable foundations of a secular nature, and a number by bodies with particular religious orientations. These vary. Most provide only study bedrooms and kitchens shared by little republics of students. Others offer common facilities like a central dining room and kitchen, a few even chapels. A number of these approximate to the social organisation of Oxford colleges, but they usually have no teaching or tutorial functions, even if there are academics or others, styled tutors, on hand to offer guidance in a loose sense to the students. Those institutions that fall into the last mentioned category may, I think, with some propriety be styled collegiate halls of residence. Broadly speaking, and largely as a legacy from Oxbridge, English and Welsh universities, with or without formal colleges about them, have intervened rather more for the general formation and social development of students than the majority of modern universities elsewhere. In some countries, most students live at home. Their parents are the ones who are responsible. Meanwhile, the 19th and 20th centuries have seen in the United States, as well as in British-influenced countries like Australia and Canada, experiments in collegiate living for students with greater or lesser degrees of success. For detailed accounts of the collegiate movement in the United States and elsewhere, and links leading to interesting online materials, see the website of The Collegiate Way. It's largely American, but has many other materials too, The Collegiate Way, and also its publications. Now, it's now the case, and this I think is interesting, especially, but by no means only in the United States of America, that with universities and colleges increasingly dominated by liberal and or woke administrations, professoriates, and representative student bodies, numbers of what some have begun to style offshore entities have come into being, near major academic institutions, and yet in a quite deliberate manner, wholly independent of them, to provide elements of a liberal arts and political moral education that are no longer institutionally desired or formally possible within these others. There is often, I think, something really quite collegial about such private entities, which may offer, for example, occasional commensality, congenial places for private study, access to borrowable and hard-to-find books, out-of-town reading parties for occasional bouts of intense collegial living and commensality, some not strictly curricular academic and social activities, as well as an approximation to a traditionally conceived tutorial system of mentoring that is otherwise unavailable to most students. Again, there's a very interesting website that deals with some of this. Before closing, what I want to do is to lay before you 4 points for provocation. First, Stefan Collini tells us that Sandy Lindsay, who was Master of Balliol and Vice-Chancellor of Oxford before World War II, sought, and I quote, to combat the evils of specialisation, unquote, by means including the new Modern Grades, or PPE course. But, to cite Collini again, he always insisted that one of the virtues of the Oxford system was that, quote, our units of common life do not reflect the division and specialisation of our studies, unquote. Lindsay suggested that ever-increasing specialisation cried out for what he called some corrective, and clearly he thought that colleges were part of that corrective. So true collegiality remains institutionally, I think, such a corrective, however much it's linguistically abused and watered down by empire-building academic bureaucrats. I think that merits reflection in these days of colloquium and so on. One really can, I think, speak of virtues in a system that at its best, if not in all cases, looks to growth in such worked-up qualities and habits via socialised living. Second, the English political philosopher Michael Oakeshott used to insist that true academic life was essentially a conversation. It does seem to me that collegiate life provides a locus, or perhaps a loci plural, for conversation, indeed multifarious conversations across disciplinary and social frontiers, very much more than does a big modern university at large. Third, and this is always provocative, the late Sir Roger Scruton suggested forcefully that, and I cite him, ceremony represents something far deeper than the business of the moment. Institutions without ceremony have a tawdry, improvised air to them. They're just like firms or bureaucracies. A ceremony is a way of acknowledging the existence of others, not others alive only, but others dead and unborn. It is through ceremony that you appeal to the observer, the stranger, to the person who wants to know what's going on. You are trying to stand up and vindicate yourself, to be proud of yourself as a member of something greater than yourself. So, people are recognized in ceremonies for what they really are, which is what they are for others. It is a tragedy that ceremony is disappearing from our world. Beauty and innocence are disappearing, and that has something to do with the loss of formalities generally. Those formalities went out of fashion at Oxford and Cambridge after the 60s. The attitude was, we don't wear suits, we don't wear academic gowns, we won't dine in hall, we go out for a burger. And hall, Scruton went on in his typically sharp manner, especially in lefty places like Balliol, was made into something totally informal, unquote. Well, my own undergraduate years were spent at a college which held out longer than most on the formalities, for which I, for one, hold to be actually supportive of a kind of virtuous living. Fourth and finally, the Victorian pundit, Walter Bagehot, asserted in an age rather different from our own that, and I quote, "Take an uncollegiate Englishman and you will generally find that he has no friends," unquote. Well, there's a lot in that. We can talk about it afterwards if you like, but I don't have time really, I think, to expand on it here and on the overlap that I think has often, if not always, existed between a virtuous collegiality and an institutionally embedded encouragement of the development of truly virtuous friendships. I believe someone in tomorrow's colloquium will be tackling this, at least his title suggests it, and I much look forward to hearing what he has to say about it. Well, that's my, if you like, kind of survey prior to what's happening tomorrow, and also a survey that I deliberately produced thinking that some of you might not be acquainted with the way the college system operates here, and I'd be very interested to hear your, in a sense, critiques of the system or asking for elaboration of some of the points that I've made.